Here's something most people never realize. Some of the most genuinely intelligent people don't feel intelligent at all. Not because they lack ability, not because they're hiding something, but because the very traits that reflect deeper thinking often feel like problems from the inside. Psychologists have studied this for decades, and what they've found is surprisingly consistent. High-level thinking doesn't always look like confidence. It often looks like hesitation. It often feels like doubt, and sometimes it hides behind silence. So instead of looking at intelligence through test scores or achievements, what if we looked at it through patterns? Quiet patterns, psychological patterns, the kind that show up in everyday life but are rarely recognized for what they are. Because if you've ever felt like your mind works differently, like you think too much, feel too deeply, or don't quite fit into simple conversations, this might explain more than you expect. One of the most misunderstood traits of highly intelligent individuals is overthinking. But psychologically, this is often linked to something called high metacognition, the ability to think about your own thinking. Instead of stopping at the first answer, your mind keeps going. It evaluates, questions, compares, and replays. Even small decisions can turn into complex internal discussions. You don't just think, you analyze how you think, and that creates depth. But it also creates friction. Because while others move forward quickly, your brain keeps searching for a better, more complete understanding. You revisit conversations. You notice details you didn't process in the moment. You question whether you missed something important. What looks like overthinking is often unfinished thinking. Studies in cognitive psychology show that people with higher metacognitive awareness are more likely to question their conclusions, which slows them down, but also leads to deeper accuracy over time. The cost, however, is mental exhaustion, because your mind doesn't easily accept good enough. It keeps searching, even when everything else has already moved on. Not everyone experiences solitude the same way. For many people, silence feels empty. But for deeply thoughtful individuals, silence feels necessary. Psychologists often link this to introverted cognitive processing, where the brain restores energy through internal reflection rather than external stimulation. Your mind is not inactive when you're alone. It's active in a different way. You process experiences, you revisit ideas, you connect thoughts that didn't fully form during busy moments. That's why too much social interaction can feel draining, not because you dislike people, but because constant input interrupts your internal processing system. So you step away, not to escape, but to recalibrate. Solitude is not withdrawal, it's mental alignment. And while others may interpret this as distance or isolation, it's often something deeper, a need to understand yourself before re-engaging with the world. There's a paradox that psychologists have observed repeatedly. The more aware someone is, the more likely they are to doubt themselves. This is closely related to what is known as the Kruger Effect, where individuals with lower understanding tend to overestimate their abilities, while those with higher awareness recognize how much they don't know. So instead of feeling certain, you question yourself. You revisit your thoughts. You consider alternative perspectives. You hesitate before speaking not because you lack ideas, but because you're aware of complexity. Meanwhile, others may speak confidently with far less reflection. Confidence often comes from simplicity. Doubt often comes from depth. This creates a quiet internal conflict, because externally, it can feel like you're falling behind. But internally, your mind is simply refusing to settle for incomplete understanding. And over time, that hesitation can feel like weakness, even when it's actually a sign of awareness. There's a reason surface-level conversations feel draining. Your mind is naturally drawn to meaning. Psychologically, this is linked to high openness to experience a personality trait associated with curiosity, abstract thinking, and a desire for depth. So when conversations stay at the surface, repeating predictable patterns, your brain disengages. Not out of arrogance, but out of understimulation. You're not looking for more conversation. You're looking for better conversation. Something real, something layered, something that actually makes you think. Boredom isn't lack of interest, it's lack of depth. Research suggests that individuals with higher cognitive engagement thresholds require more complex input to stay mentally stimulated. And when that input isn't present, your attention fades. So you stay quiet, not because you have nothing to say, but because nothing feels worth saying. If you've recognized yourself in these patterns, it might not feel like something positive. It might feel like stress, like isolation, like being slightly out of sync with the world around you. Because these traits don't come with clear rewards. They come with questions, with doubt, with a constant sense of searching for something deeper. But maybe the problem isn't the way you think. Maybe it's that most environments are designed for speed, while your mind is designed for depth. Not everyone processes life the same way. Some move quickly, others move carefully. And if you've ever felt different, not because you didn't understand, but because you understood too much, then maybe what feels like a flaw is simply a different way of experiencing the world. There's a subtle awareness in the way your mind observes the world. You pick up on small changes, tone shifts, facial expressions, inconsistencies in behavior. Psychologically, this is linked to heightened pattern recognition and sensory processing sensitivity, concepts explored in research on high sensitivity by psychologist Elaine Aron. Your brain processes more information more deeply before filtering it out, which means you don't just see what's obvious, you notice what's beneath it. Awareness is not always peaceful. It's often overwhelming, because noticing more means carrying more. You sense when something feels off, even if you can't immediately explain why. You read between the lines of conversations. You detect emotional signals others ignore. And while this gives you insight, it also makes it harder to ignore what others easily dismiss. Have you ever felt like your thoughts are clear until you try to explain them? This is often connected to abstract and nonlinear thinking. Your brain doesn't process ideas step by step. It forms connections in clusters, linking concepts, patterns, and meanings all at once. But language is linear. So when you try to translate something complex into simple words, it loses depth, and that gap creates frustration. Because you know what you mean, but others don't always see it the same way. Complexity is easy to feel, but difficult to translate. Neuroscience research suggests that highly connected neural networks allow for faster idea synthesis, but not always easier communication. So sometimes silence becomes easier than explanation. Not because you lack clarity, but because your clarity doesn't fit into simple sentences. There's a kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from action. It comes from thinking. Even when you're physically still, your mind is active processing, analyzing, reflecting. Psychologists refer to this as cognitive load, the amount of mental effort being used at any given time. And for individuals with highly active thinking patterns, that load is consistently high. You're not just reacting to the present moment. You're connecting it to the past, projecting it into the future, analyzing it from multiple angles. You're not tired from doing too much, you're tired from processing too deeply. And because this activity is invisible, it often goes unrecognized. But internally, your mind rarely stops. And over time, that constant mental movement creates a quiet, persistent fatigue. Some people follow systems without thinking about them. But your mind doesn't work that way. You naturally question rules, traditions, and expectations, not out of rebellion, but out of curiosity. This is often linked to independent thinking and low conformity bias, a tendency to evaluate ideas rather than accept them automatically. You want to understand the why behind things. And when something doesn't make sense, it stays in your mind. You don't resist systems, you analyze them. But this can create distance. Because while others adapt quickly, you pause, you reflect, you evaluate. And that places you slightly outside the flow of the crowd. Not disconnected, just operating from a different perspective. Intelligence is rarely what people expect it to be. It doesn't always sound confident. It doesn't always feel certain. And it doesn't always look impressive from the outside. Sometimes it looks like hesitation. Sometimes it feels like doubt. And often it exists quietly in the way someone observes, questions, and reflects. Psychologically, giftedness is not just about knowing more. It's about processing differently, more deeply, more intensely, more persistently. And because that depth comes with its own weight, many people spend years misunderstanding themselves. But maybe the difference was never a flaw. Maybe it was a pattern of thinking that doesn't settle for simple answers. And perhaps the real sign isn't how much you know, but how deeply you continue to question, even when no one else does.